I would like to so much thank Patty and her entire team for the tireless work, especially over 2 years, to put this conference together. I am very honored to be the plenary again. It is always a pleasure to come back and meet with people that I truly enjoy working with. My background in special education, first as a teacher, then as an advocate for parents, then as a mediator for the California State Department of Education, then as a consultant and mediation partner for the Wisconsin Special Education Mediation System for over 12 years. And for the past 20 years, overlapping all of that, working with special ed professionals in the area of conflict resolution training and in gender and culture work. Our focus on the plenary today is implicit bias. And as we start this program together, I'd like us all to think of ourselves as having a growth mindset. And what does that mean? You are already really good at what you do. You're good teachers, administrators, psychologists, everyone in the field of special education, I hold my hat up to because they are so inspiring and work in one of the hardest fields I think possible. Every day you work with kids. Every day you work to make things better. And that is truly inspirational to me. And I also think that what makes us good as a profession is that we have a growth mindset. We're always looking, no matter how good we are, at becoming better. And so I would like us to have that overview as we move forward together today. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using a PowerPoint, and I regret that we don't have the interaction that we normally do when we're all together, but I will kind of come back and forth with you over time through this presentation. So let's start the screen. And we will start our conference with implicit bias, moving beyond awareness to knowledge and skills. And as we talk about this topic, I would like you to be thinking about the fact that we'll have 3 goals for this session. First is awareness, that growth mindset, that internal motivation for us to find out what is going on, what is happening in our brains when implicit bias happens. Also for knowledge, to understand what implicit bias is and what it is not. When people hear the word bias, they immediately think of prejudice and discrimination and racism, but implicit bias in and of itself is not that. It's something we all have. And so it's going to be something that we want to explore more fully. And then there are the specific skills, and they need to be intentional, they need to be cognitive, they need to be specific. Because if we say, I just want to become more bias aware, the odds are that our behavior won't even change. No matter what the aspirational goal that we have, as far as saying, I want to become much more aware, unless we do specific things, intentional things, cognitive things, our behavior will probably not change. So we want to look for those. And so we're dividing it into 3 parts. Awareness and knowledge is going to come first. What is implicit or unconscious bias? It's a natural process of our brain. Everybody's brain does this. And what happens is that 11 million bits of information that we receive constantly from the stimulus of our environment keeps coming in. And as it comes in, it's bombarding our brain, and our brain says, whoa, that's an awful lot of stuff. What am I going to do with it? And so some of it, our brain just screens out. It says, I realize that I'm sitting in a classroom, but right now I'm not noticing the trees outside. I'm not noticing the person next to me. I'm not hearing the fan over the head. It's what I'm focusing on right now. And the brain chooses on what to focus, because we're only consciously processing 40 bits of all those millions of bits of information. And most of that is taking place on an unconscious level. When we screen things out, it's called inattentional blindness. We are literally blind to a lot of things that are in front of us. If we tried to absorb it all, we couldn't. Our brain would just go, I can't handle this. I can't handle this. So how does our brain know what to screen out and what to allow in and how to put things in those chunks? Well, it depends on our own individual life. So it depends on our culture. It depends on our ethnicity. It depends on our gender, our age, our sexual orientation, our neighborhood, our job, our family, our friends, our social circle, our training and education. So basically from everywhere that has surrounded us in our life. All of that experience, all of that exposure is what tells our brain how to put things into different groups and how to categorize things. And this is a really important skill of the brain, because way back when we were on the plains or we were out in the forest and we needed to know what was safe and what wasn't safe and whether we run or whether we stay, whether we fight or whether we freeze, our brain would go, danger, danger, run from that, or stand your ground, and it would protect us. And so that's a good thing. But the difficult part of when our brain is doing this is because it's basing how it's making its decisions for us about what we see, feel, hear, and what we ignore, we can have what's called bounded awareness. And that means that if I don't have an exposure to a particular group or a particular person or a particular type of work or a particular culture, that lack of exposure limits the chunks and the groups and the categorizations that I can do. And it makes them small. It makes them so that there's fewer of those. And what happens then is that those chunks and those groups and those classifications in our brain begin to create stereotypes. And those stereotypes is what can lead us to biased judgment, biased behavior, which can turn into discrimination and prejudice and racism if we're not careful. It's what becomes a me versus you, or a them versus us. Or that person's the same, so I feel comfortable with that person, but that person's different and I don't know very much about them, so danger. What becomes normal? What's abnormal? What becomes right? And what becomes wrong? And so everybody has this happening in their brain. And what does that mean? It means that no one is bias-free. No one is. When people say, well, I have no biases, I'm just thinking, no, it just means you're not aware of what the biases are that you have. And so our goal is not to be bias-free. Our goal is to become bias-aware, because we're always creating new ones. And so if we're not aware that it's even a process that's happening to us, we can fall victim to those prejudices and those stereotypes that we create. Now, what's hard about this is that the biases that are implicit, which means unconscious, and we don't even know we have them, are oftentimes quite different than our stated beliefs, especially in socially charged topics like race and gender. What does that mean? Well, I can say, I believe in equality. I believe in equity. I've devoted much of my life fighting for those things and teaching cross-cultural issues and gender issues and how to work through biases. And I feel very strongly in equity and equality. And yet, that's my stated belief. I may still have implicit biases that, if I'm not careful, will impact my actual behavior. Because prejudice is conscious attitude, it's conscious belief, but the implicit bias is unconscious. And so we have to be thinking about, okay, I have to acknowledge that I still have those things. Here's an example. A lot of people say, well, you know what? I don't really see color. Color doesn't matter to me. It doesn't make any difference to me. I'd like to point out that most people who say, I don't see color, are white. And that in fact, when we say we have color blindness, it comes from a lack of awareness of the impact of culture on someone's life, and an understanding that we think we can step into somebody else's shoes. When in fact, how can we possibly do that, first of all? And secondly, how can we do that if we don't even understand the impact that color has or gender has on anyone's life? In addition, if you don't see someone's color, then you're denying who that person is, what is wonderful about them, but also as well as the struggles that someone of color has had to go through. Color blindness assumes that color does not affect the experiences that people have. I mean, if I don't see color, then how could it make any difference? But what that ignores is that everybody has what we call tailwinds and headwinds. Tailwinds are the things that can push us forward and give us an advantage and give us the motivation to keep going because we see success from the tailwinds that are pushing us forwards. Headwinds are those things that hold us back, that we fight against, that we say, wait a minute. I just feel like I'm pushing against something. I have to try 10 times as hard. Those are the headwinds that push against us. And we all have tailwinds and headwinds. All of us do. However, the tailwinds and the headwinds are different depending on who we are as an individual. It might relate to poverty. It might relate to gender. It might relate to sexual preference. It might relate to education, but everybody has tailwinds and headwinds. So it's difficult to claim that you care about equality if you are blind to the realities of inequality. And what does that mean? It means specifically in the area of color. If we have color blindness, it means we're failing to account for ethnic identity status, the long history of oppression in many cultures, the rates of acculturation, how people have either acclimated, acculturized, or kept within their own culture and been more insular, the societal pressures, the family pressures, the different worldview that is based on cultural experiences, even communication patterns. And while I understand what the motivation is for someone to say, I have color blindness, the intent is to say, I don't have prejudice, I don't discriminate. You are an individual to me. I value you for that. Your color doesn't matter. I understand all those things. But the problem is if we don't acknowledge that color impacts, then we are oblivious. We are blind to the impacts of color on someone's life. And as we expand that, also gender, all the other things we talked about, because bias can occur in many areas. So if we have this, when does it happen? When do those implicit biases kick in? They happen when we're thinking quickly. We're going, I got to make a snap judgment about this. It happens when we take shortcuts and aren't curious. It happens when we're under stress. It happens when we're making assumptions about programs or institutions or people. It happens when we're following our gut or our instinct. So I'm not saying don't follow your gut. When someone says, I've been teaching for a long time, I just have an instinct about these things. Or I've worked with people as an administrator for a very long time. And, sometimes I know the best thing I can do is follow my gut. And I understand that. And that's not a bad thing. Our quote, intuition that we have is not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to know that that is when we're also susceptible to the implicit biases that we have. What does that mean? What do implicit biases, what can they lead to? Well, for one thing, there's something called the affinity bias. And the affinity bias is something where we, just as human beings, feel more comfortable when we're connecting with people more like ourselves. Our brain is saying same, this is same. And so what happens if we are more comfortable with people who are more like ourselves, then that's who we tend to hang out with. We say, oh, I work in a diverse environment. But when you hang out with somebody, are you hanging out with diverse people? In your informal one-to-one interactions, when you talk to someone in the hallway, when you're meeting somebody in the teacher's lounge, when you're at a big conference for special education, who are you hanging out with? Think about that. Your affinity bias can also impact when you're looking for a good fit. If you're hiring someone, if you're hiring a special ed teacher, psychologist, speech therapist, who makes a good fit in the workplace. And when I'm working with companies and corporations and school districts, I'll say, what does good fit mean to you? When you say good fit, what is that? When we look for kids to place in classrooms, we have to be careful here. What's a good fit for a classroom? Yes, we say we're basing it on testing and observation and all sorts of things, but our implicit biases can also kick in here if we're not careful. How we look at how people perform can be impacted by implicit bias, how we judge competence. So what we know from studies is if someone is the same as me, if someone's in the same in-group, and in-group doesn't always mean color or gender, it can also mean profession, it can mean age, it can mean faith, whatever the in-group is. But let's say I'm hiring someone and I'll say, you know what? I think that person has a lot of potential. That's why I want that person to come into my school. Out-groups, we tend to judge differently. An out-group is someone who's not the same as me. And we tend to say, well, what's their performance level? What are they doing now? And we need to be aware of that. Again, as we assess kids, as we look at who we have in the schools, who we hire, what's the potential versus what's the performance? If we truly didn't have implicit bias, then we would judge both in-group and out-group the same. But research shows that we don't. Who we judge to be telling the truth or not telling the truth has a lot to do with our implicit biases. When people say to me, oh, I'm pretty good at telling when people lie. Well, most of us aren't, in fact, very good at telling when people lie. And we may judge it again on our comfort level, our affinity level, our experience with someone or their culture or their gender. Implicit bias can impact that. Whether we perceive someone to be deserving. Does this person deserve me or the services, or does this parent deserve my patience? Implicit bias can impact that. And literally how we communicate with each other, our implicit biases can affect. It affects our body language, the tone and inflection we use with somebody. Are we patronizing? Are we direct? Are we indirect? How long do we smile at someone? Whether we make eye contact, whether we blink a lot. The tone of voice we use, whether we perceive someone to be angry, sad, frustrated. If I am used to people being angry the way I'm angry, or this sad the way I'm sad, or frustrated the same way I get frustrated, I may have implicit biases about people who express those emotions differently. I've had people say to me, I can't really understand why this parent is so upset. I mean, they're being so destructive. They're just so, just enraged. There must be something wrong with them. Well, maybe there is, or maybe it's a different way of expressing anger, especially if anger for you in your life has been something that has been more restrained. I've also had the flip side where people will say, well, this parent doesn't seem to care very much about really what's happening to their child's program. And we are trying to judge those through our own filters, that parent through our own filter. As if I was that parent, what would I be feeling? How would I be showing that I was interested in my child's education? But in-groups and out-groups treat each other differently. And so someone may come from a culture where to show frustration, to show anger, to show passion about a program, or even to acknowledge that there's something wrong with their child, and I'm putting that in quotes, because depending on the culture, how children with special needs are perceived is very, very different. And so if I'm using my own implicit bias, I'm not even aware of it, I may be making a judgment about that parent that is completely inaccurate, because I'm perceiving them through my filter, my exposure. And that exposure may be a very bounded awareness, as we talked about last time, depending on my knowledge. So these biased assumptions and judgments can lead to personal and institutional and systemic racism in education, in employment, in criminal justice, in voting rights, in health and medical care, and in housing. So the implications of implicit bias, which in and of itself may not be bad, because again, it's helping us. That's why we got it in the first place. Same, different, run, fight, flight, freeze. It's a protection. But if we're not aware of how it can impact us in other ways, then we run the risk of having something that we are doing be biased. In addition, when we come into a system, whatever that system is, whether it's education, whether it's law, whether it's employment, if there are norms within a system or an institution that reflect that implicit bias, and I come into that system without that particular implicit bias, that can impact me. That can now create in me an implicit bias that I didn't even have before because of a system that I have now been in, because again, that now becomes part of my awareness. My brain is putting things into new chunks based on what I'm learning within a system. So let's think about our mindsets. Let's think about our educator's mindset. What is the origin of mine? Now, it could be you're an administrator. It could be that you're a physical therapist or an occupational therapist or a speech therapist or a regular classroom teacher, a mediator, facilitator, any number of multiple jobs. So I want you to look at your own mindset. and how you approach your work, whatever that work is. And I want you to think about your life in general, how you were raised, what was normal, in quotes, what was abnormal, in quotes, what was discipline, what was not discipline, what was acceptance, what all of those things, how you were raised. I want you to think about your training and where you got it. I want you to think about your experience in education. Have you worked in diverse environments or not? You work in an urban area or rural area? Do you work in an area where there's lots of services for kids or it's difficult to find them? Do you work in a big school or a small school? What did you learn from all of that? What is your level of exposure to diverse cultures and genders? I remember when I was teaching at a Southern university, and one of my students came up to me when I teach academic courses in cross culture and gender. And she said to me, you know, I'm really ashamed of this. And I said, well, what are you ashamed of? And she said, you know, I grew up in a very rural area of the state, and I have very, very limited exposure to diverse cultures. And I have to tell you, everything I learned from my parents. And now as I'm thinking about it, as I'm thinking about that exposure that I had, and now that I'm getting new exposure to cultures, I realize how limited I was. And I realize really what you're talking about when you talk about bounded awareness. And I'm really ashamed of some of the things that I thought about. And I said, you didn't know. What matters now is what you do with that knowledge. You can live in guilt or shame, or you can feel bad for what you did before, but it really matters now with your growth mindset, where you're going with this new knowledge. How can you change your mindset over time? So I ask you, how has your educator's mindset changed over time as you've had new experiences? And then I want you to kind of go deep. And I want you after this presentations, or even now, if you can, to think about, where do your own implicit biases show up? I want you to think about the last time you were in an IEP meeting. I want you to think about the last time you had a staff meeting. I want you to think about some of these things. Think about, when could they have shown up? Because here's some awareness questions I want you to think about. Do you pride yourself on being a quick thinker? Many of us do. I do. I think everyone always says to me, oh, you think so quickly on your feet. And I used to be so proud of that and say, well, yeah, I'm a quick thinker. And then I started thinking about implicit bias and thinking, you know what, maybe I'm not taking enough time. Maybe I just need to slow down a bit and think about how I'm making some of these quick decisions that I make. Do I make assumptions about credibility and abilities of people, administrators, teachers, parents, students? We all do. So we should all be saying yes to this, because we are constantly making assumptions. Assumptions are not necessarily bad, but they should not be, I know, meaning I know this about a person. They should be, I wonder if my assumption is correct, rather than thinking, I know that my assumption is correct. Because if, again, we're not curious, we miss all those danger signs. Do you have time pressures in your work? Yes, most of us do. Do you sometimes get irritated, overwhelmed, or frustrated? And I would say especially over this last year, where we've had so many issues related to COVID and not knowing what was going to happen, where school is going to open, not open, what were people's responsibilities, parents getting upset because their children weren't getting the special needs help that they were supposed to have in an IEP, and yet the schools were closed. I mean, it was just a nightmare. So of course we get irritated, overwhelmed, or frustrated. Do you state your opinion about possible placements, evaluations, and assessment results? Depending on your role, you probably do. You are stating your opinion about all of these things. And again, are you trusting your gut? I'm not saying not to state your opinion. I'm saying be aware. Be aware. These are the lack of curiosity danger signs that I see the most. One is a lack of curiosity. I had a student like this in my class last year. And lest you think that this is just for education, this is not. When I teach lawyers and they say, oh, I had a case like this last year, or even last week, I'll go, no, you didn't. They go, yeah, all the factors are the same. And I go, no, they're not. You're dealing with someone else. So when we say I had a student like this in my class here, that's a danger sign, because what will happen here is that if we're comparing these students together, what we will see in this new student is the result also of something called confirmation bias, which is every time I thought I had a student like this last year, oh yeah, these two students, these two students are similar, then confirmation bias kicks in, and that's what says yes to everything that validates my previous thought about the similarity of these students, and it rejects the things that say, wait, no, this is different. And my brain goes, no, that probably doesn't matter as much as this other thing. And the other thing is what makes those students alike. And so we have to be very careful that we don't fall into that confirmation bias when we're saying, I had a fill in the blank, a teacher like this, a student like this, a principal like this last year. No, you didn't. In fact, even if you had the same person, they're different than they were a week ago. Nothing surprises me anymore. This is really dangerous because, again, no curiosity. I can usually predict how much progress a student will make by the end of the year. Hopefully you cannot. I realize that the IEP is trying to say, based on the studies that we have, these are the goals for our students. But when I also hear parents say to me, you know what, I get these goals and then I don't really hear anything from the teacher until the end of the year. Why? I mean, I realize that may be a minority of situations and that most teachers are much better at ongoing progress reports to their students. But I also hear quite often that there's not this update. And I hear from teachers, well, you know, I have a year to do this. To me, the IEP is evolving constantly as students change, as they grow, as we get new information. And if we sort of feel like, okay, I can predict based on the IEP, or I can just predict because of my experience, we have to be really careful about those. These are predictions, these are goals. Wouldn't it be great if things were even better than that? Self-fulfilling prophecy. We have to be careful of our expectations. If you look at the quote at the bottom, when we only perceive what we expect, we create an echo chamber where there are few surprises. If we say, well, there's only one parent in the home, so I'm assuming there won't be a lot of follow through because they're so busy or because they have other kids. Yes, that may be correct, but maybe not. Lack of curiosity. We have a large number of special needs children from this particular group, race, neighborhood, etc. Why? I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm asking why. Be curious. If you're seeing a particular group that's underrepresented, overrepresented in your classrooms, why is that? It could be coincidence. It could be implicit bias. Be aware. Be aware. So let's talk about skills. Number one, do not deny, ignore, or excuse implicit bias. We all have it. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something we're saying, I don't have implicit bias. No, we all do. Everybody does. It's hard to solve a problem without acknowledging that there's a problem in the first place. It's our brain doing its normal stuff. We just have to be aware it's doing it. And this is what makes it hard. We want to believe we're good people. We are good people. And the more we worry about not being a good person, because there's this cognitive dissonance here. How can I be a good person and have bias? So therefore, I am a good person, so I can't have bias. And I feel threatened if I admit my bias because that means I'm not a good person anymore. So when we're in this level of self-threat, because we're having to look at our identity differently, when we're in that level of self-threat, we don't want to admit we have bias. And there's stress. And the higher the level of stress, here's the irony of the whole thing, the greater level of implicit bias that we have. The more stress, the more implicit bias. What's created that stress? The self-threat. What's created that self-threat? The fact that we want to be a good person, therefore we can't have bias. You have to be internally motivated to change. You have to seek to change those biases and the stereotypes that are harmful to you and to other people. And you have to learn specific skills, having that growth mindset instead of a status quo mindset. A status quo mindset is where we say, well, I'm pretty good doing what I do. I'm actually a really good teacher, principal, administrator. I'm fine. Thanks very much. This is educational, but I'm good because it's safe. It's hard when we try something else. It's hard when we make changes, and we stumble when we do it and we make mistakes. But it's better to stumble upward and make change than to fall backward. Each of us will always be a work in progress. We need to notice more. We need to focus less. Sometimes we're so focused that we make mistakes because we're not seeing the bigger picture, noticing as much as we should. Stop, look, listen, observe objectively. Remember, a prototype should never become a stereotype. And what does that mean? A prototype is something that's developed where we can say across cultures that certain cultures tend to, or may have a certain cultural attribute more than another culture. For example, some cultures use more direct speech, direct, straightforward, to the point, telling things like it is. For some people, that's inappropriate. For cultures that come from indirect speech, that kind of direct speech is very harsh, it's very judgmental, it's very domineering, it's very assaultive. And so indirect speakers don't speak directly to a point. They talk around the point. And if you can look to where my little picture is, they talk around the point like this. Here's the point, and they're circling that point. And they're hoping that you will intuit from what they're saying what that point actually is without telling you directly what that point is. And so direct people come from certain cultures, in quotes, and indirect people come from certain cultures. That's a prototype. But if we say everybody from a particular culture will be direct and everybody from this other culture will be indirect, that becomes a stereotype. So we don't want to do that. We want to say there may be, could be, not there will be. Because every person has both unique and shared traits. We need to be conscious of fundamental attribution error. What does that mean? We talked before about the error of stepping into someone else's shoes. I think it's actually arrogant, that's my personal opinion, to step into someone else's shoes. And why is that? I'm going to stop share for just a minute here so I can talk to you about this. When we say that we're going to try to step into someone else's shoes, the best we're going to be doing is putting our feet into their shoes. And those shoes won't fit us exactly because they weren't made for us. We haven't worn them in. We don't know how they feel exactly. They won't fit. So trying to step into someone else's shoes means we're trying to use our own filter to try to judge why someone's doing what they're doing, why they're feeling, and what they're going through. Can't do it because we don't have that filter. That doesn't mean we don't have empathy. Empathy is a sense of understanding that someone's going through something and that we want to help, support, be curious in whatever way we can to assist that person. But to assume what they're feeling or needing is inappropriate. That's why we have to be curious, because my filter is not the same as your filter. When I lost a child and someone said to me, I understand exactly what that's like. No, you don't. Just like I don't understand what it would be to be a young Black man being pulled over by the police. My filter is different. His filter is different. All of our filters are different. And so we have to be very careful when we say, I want to be that person, feel that person, change that person, whatever it is that we're trying to do when we try to step in someone else's shoes, make that person better, show them I care. Be careful that you're not making mistakes of what that person needs based on what you would need if you were them. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. So we want to be flexible. We want to be open. We want to be curious. We want to be humble. We want to think, I wonder if, rather than I know that. We want to be willing to feel uncomfortable and to be challenged. This is hard. No one likes to feel uncomfortable, but if people are trying to make us feel safe all the time when they challenge us, I think uncomfortableness every once in a while is important. I think it's important for someone to say, when you said that to me, you showed bias. And for us to be willing to hear that without being defensive, to acknowledge if we've made a mistake and express a willingness to grow. You can say, that was not my intention, and stop. But when you say that's not my intention, there's no growth. If you say that was not my intention, would you be willing to tell me what I did wrong? And if you don't believe you did anything wrong, then you could at least say, that was not my intention. Would you be willing to talk with me about this? It's showing a desire to learn, a desire to grow, a desire to add to what you are in your awareness of bias. And be kind to yourself. This is hard work. We are all learning. Also be careful and conscious of what we call the honeymoon of acquaintance. What does that mean? It means that when you make a mistake across genders, across cultures, across space, whatever it might be, when you make a mistake, oftentimes the first time someone will say, well, you didn't know that that word was offensive to me, or you didn't know when you made that assumption really what my own life experience was. So, I'm giving you a pass on this time. But if we repeat those mistakes over and over and over again, then that honeymoon, that period where people will say, okay, that was a mistake. She didn't know. Now she does. It's going to be okay. That honeymoon does not last forever if we continue to make those same mistakes. Start evaluating your reaction to sources of information. As teachers, as administrators, as parents, we are constantly evaluating and having reactions to sources of information that we get. Now, why is this important? Part of our jobs, whatever our job is to do that evaluation. But our implicit biases can affect the filters that we hear that information through. So is my reaction to information a reaction to the person or a reaction to that information? Is it a reaction to their communication styles and how they're telling me that information? Is it a reaction to the behaviors that they're exhibiting, where I'm making an assumption from those behaviors about that information? And why is that? We're all doing it. So let's just acknowledge when we hear information from different people, we have different reactions. And we could have what's called reactive devaluation, which means devaluing, making less valuable. Reactively, which means from my gut rather than from my cognitive processes. Reactive devaluation means if I like you and you give me some information, I'm more likely to believe that information. If I don't like you, I can say, well, gosh, I never really liked Nina all that much. And so, yeah, I don't really trust this information she's sharing. So we do know that who delivers this information does impact how we react to that information, whether it's true, whether it's not. Does it have credibility? Whose voices am I muting? Am I saying, yeah, there they go again, blah, 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 right? Think about that. And is that a result of an implicit bias that you may have from that person? I remember one time when I was in an IEP meeting. This was when I was as a teacher, so a long time ago, right? Long time ago in the 70s and early 80s. And I remember that one of the teachers, regular classroom teachers that was there, I was a special ed teacher, made a comment after one of the parents left. Both parents had left. And she said, well, I am really, really surprised, at how knowledgeable and how concise they were, just the way they spoke. And I turned to the teacher and I said, well, why would that be surprising to you? And she said, well, their background. And I said, what background? And she said, well, don't look at me like that. You know what I'm talking about. Pause. Think about it. The parents were Black, highly educated. One was a teacher, one was a doctor. And so then I just paused and I said, well, one's a teacher and one's a doctor. And they've obviously done a lot of research. Why would you be surprised? And she said, well, maybe I should put it another way. I mean, I'm just really proud of what they've made of themselves. And what do you do with that? What do you do with that? Think about your reactions to people, their communication styles, their behaviors, both that teacher's reaction to those parents, but also what you would do in that moment when that teacher says those things. Be aware of your body language. Again, we talked about eye contact, body posture, connection. Check your thoughts. Say a sentence to yourself. When you're about to say something or think something about someone, replace she with he. Because if you switch she with he and suddenly that doesn't really make that much sense, maybe you had some implicit bias in what you're about to say. What if you replace black with white, white with black? Suddenly, does that sentence change? Does it show an implicit bias that you may have there? Does it sound weird? Does it sound wrong? Check yourself. Check yourself. Be aware of timing. Remember, we talked so much about how implicit bias really comes into play when we are pressured, when we're hurrying. Slow down. Analyze what you're prioritizing, whether that's in an assessment, whether that's in talking to a parent, whether that's in looking at what you're putting into an IEP. Why are you prioritizing certain things? Write things down. Everybody uses computers now, but write them down by hand, because the more senses you use, the better. And I don't mean the more senses meaning multitasking. I mean, as you're focusing or as you're thinking or as you're being more aware, use your senses. Reduce your distractions. Put away the phone. Put it away. We know that phones, and I do a whole talk on phones. When a phone is on the desk, people behave differently. If you have it on your desk and you're meeting with a parent, or you're in an IEP and you have a phone there, completely changes the dynamic. Just the presence of the phone changes that dynamic. And certainly don't check it, all right? Just remove it from any meeting that you possibly can. Think about credit sharing, and this is something that we are maybe not as aware of as we should. When you're in a meeting, whether you're a principal and your teachers are talking, whether you're in an IP meeting, parents are talking, think about who proposed an idea that no one really responded to, and then 10 minutes later, someone else proposed it, and it was suddenly a great idea. Why is that? I will let you know that I work with a lot of companies in the tech industry, and women consistently say in certain professions, and technology is one of them, that oftentimes they're in a work-related meeting and they'll come up with an idea and it will sort of be ignored, or just there's a little polite nod. And then 10 minutes later, someone came up with the same idea, look at that in quotes, came up with that same idea. And someone said, "That's a great idea." And the women say to me, "I don't understand. I mean, I just said that." And I say, "Well, what do you do about that when they say that?" And oftentimes I say, "Well, I get mad and I say, I said that 5 minutes ago or 10 minutes ago, and you're not giving me any credit." I said, "Well, that's a way to do it. You can certainly be more direct. You can be a little bit more accusatory. I'm not judging that. But what another option might be if you say, you know what, I'm so glad you brought that up, because when I brought it up 10 minutes ago, it means like you've really been thinking about it and processing it. And now we can really expand on what I said and what you're adding to that. That's terrific." So you're not having someone lose face, but you are definitely pointing out that you came up with that idea yourself. Over-crediting ourselves is what a lot of us do. I hear this all the time, whether it's people in law or education or business. I solved the problem. I came up with that idea. Now, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, maybe it was a group. Think about a team meeting and what team means, but also realize that certain groups, and when we say certain groups, I usually mean marginalized groups, which oftentimes people of color or women, undercrediting people from those groups that already face bias is very common. So it may not be a big deal to you if you're in a meeting with parents and you say, "I had this great idea," after there's been a lot of discussion, or "I did this," or "I did that." But realize if it's something that someone has been experiencing on a daily basis for much of their life, their filter when you say "I," when it really was a "we," has a very different impact than maybe it would to you. And when people say, oh gosh, that sounds so politically correct, or oh, Nina, you're like micromanaging everything here. Just be aware that everybody's filters are the same. And if you have experienced either discrimination or undercrediting or microaggressions throughout your life, every time another one happens, it's no longer a little tiny paper cut. Now the wound is really big. And so we need to be more aware, more conscious of things like that when we start to share credit. Be deliberate in your mediations and your facilitations. What does that mean? I know under the law, certain people are required or suggested to come to meetings, depending on what the kind of meeting that you have, like an IEP meeting, mediations, facilitations, all of that. But I also want you to think who does get invited and who does not get invited. If it's voluntary, if it's something where you can say to a parent, would you like to bring anyone with you? Who represents people that that parent can relate to? Someone, whether it's age, whether it's gender, whether it's race, is that important? I even point out, and I don't see this in schools very often. Sometimes I'll see photos when I walk into an office of all the teachers, and I think that's very cool. But what I've also seen happen is if there's not a diverse population of teachers, and it's a diverse population of students, that does have an impact on parents when they come into an office. So just be aware of that. I talk about this a lot with law firms who have panels of retired judges, many of whom are white and over the age of 60. And I say, that's great. That shows experience, knowledge, and expertise. The flip side is you are setting an environment here about who is in this environment. And when people come in who are different than all those photos along the wall, they will have a different reaction to it than you may. Where are people sitting? Think about session design and view. And I don't mean view meaning outside to a great ocean or something. I mean, do people have line of sight? Who do they look at? Who do they have to turn to look at? Is it round? Is it square? I know you don't have a huge budget, but how you set up your rooms can indicate power to people. Another way of indicating power is who speaks, who talks the most. Who did you not hear from at all? Who was silent and why was that? Who was interrupted during the meeting and who did the interrupting? That may not seem like a big deal to you. People from marginalized groups get interrupted more than dominant culture. This is hard to hear, but it's true, and we know this from research, that people from marginalized groups in a large meeting get interrupted more, get it more. They don't do the interrupting usually, and they're not the one who usually talks the most. That creates a pattern. This is where internal norms, if we're not careful, can become systemic. Our passion and conviction receive the same from everyone. Does everyone have the same range of emotions available without judgment from others? Oh, that parent, or oh, that teacher, oh, that person is so emotional. Okay, maybe they have feeling the same level of emotion, right, as you, but they express it differently. How can we acknowledge that emotion at the same time not have it be destructive? I'm not saying that you have huge emotional outbursts that should be happening in your sessions, in your meetings, in your mediations, but I am saying that people express it differently. So every once in a while, I might say to someone, does this feel constructive to you? Or if I'm a mediator, I may turn to a parent in a separate meeting and say, I just wanted to touch base with you. Because sometimes when I talk about anger with parents or I do parent trainings, I'll say, you know what? I'm not saying you don't have a right to be angry. You're angry. I'm not telling you not to be angry. I want to talk about how you're expressing that anger. Because if you're angry about everything all the time, you will just be seen as an angry parent. And the very important things that you're saying will not be heard the same way. In fact, they may be ignored or dismissed because you're an angry parent. You need to target and focus and say, this is what I'm passionate about because X, Y, Z. So think about those emotions and how you're expressing them so that they can be heard and the importance of what you're saying can be heard. So I can kind of coach and acknowledge that emotions are good, but how emotions are used. When people say to me, well, I want a mediator so the meeting doesn't get emotional. I go, well, I'm not saying it's not going to get emotional. I'm going to say it's going to be constructive, because it's important that people can express themselves in a way, but it's also important that the people who are receiving those emotions don't feel attacked and are also heard. Think about having a dialogue, not a monologue. What does that mean? Ask questions instead of making statements. That gets that curiosity piece back for you. Create a place of psychological safety, because when you do, when people feel safe, they are more likely to speak up, ask for help, admit mistakes, propose ideas. They're more willing to take blame if they feel safe. I should have done this and I didn't, and I'm sorry. But people don't do that when they're attacked. They don't take blame. They don't like to confess uncertainty. If someone says, I think you're incompetent. I had a teacher say one time, I did make a mistake, but when that parent attacked me the way they attacked me, I'm not about to confess that I made a mistake, because that just gives them more ammunition. They just get angrier. Then they don't trust me. And so we learn more, we perform better, we work better together when we feel safe. So we have to think about, how do I create that safe environment for people? Expand your exposure. That means your personal and your work circle to include other cultures and genders and ways of life and communication styles, etc. Think about, who do I go out with? Right now, we don't go out with anyone very, very well, except our immediate circle that's in our house, or under very controlled circumstances because of the virus. However, think about even who you FaceTime with. Who do you talk to when you're frustrated? When you want to think about a new way of doing things, who do you talk to about that? And when we are able to freely socialize again and be able to work side by side, who am I sitting next to? Who I'm talking to? Who do I say, let's go out for coffee at the end of a hard day of work? Expand that. Nudge yourself. Just nudge yourself. Make an effort. Change bounded awareness to willful awareness. I'm no longer going to be bounded with this particular group or gender or faith or age. I remember a young student said to me, well, you know what I'm doing? And I said, what? And she said, well, I took the Harvard Implicit Bias test, which, by the way, is in the resources at the end of this presentation. And you can take bias awareness, bias tests on a variety of topics. And she happened to take the one that was on age. And interestingly, age is one of the areas where there's a high level of implicit bias, very high level of implicit bias. And so she said, I wanted to take that. And she said, and what I am doing now, she goes, I go once a week and I go to an assisted living facility and I teach music and I talk to them. And she said, I'm relatively young and they call me cutie and everything. And I have to be careful because I realize that they may have implicit bias about me just as I had about them. She says, but I am learning and I'm moving from my bounded awareness to seeing it from a much broader exposure and experience. Remember to educate other people, because silence is complicit and part of the problem. When we don't speak up, when we don't say that there's a problem, then we are just bystanders, and bystanders don't have an impact on change. And so what we have to do is you can decide how you want to talk about it. Some people are very direct and say, I don't like what you said, or what you said was racist. Other people say, you know what? I can't change your belief, but I can change, hopefully, your behavior. And I will tell you that we cannot have conversation like this together, because I will not stay and listen to what you're saying when you say it that way. It's not okay with me. And some people will just laugh and say, you must be kidding. I can't believe you even said that. Regardless of how people respond, they are responding rather than being silent and going home saying, oh, I should have said something about that and I didn't. Be reflectful and thoughtful, not reactive from our guts. Ask questions like, what does a good fit mean? Remember, we talked about that earlier. What does a good fit mean? It is easier to change behavior than it is to change belief. And I truly believe that if we say there is external motivation, if we have, as institutions, especially educational institutions, we have the power to be a model, both personally, interpersonally, with the programs that we have organizationally and how we structure our school systems and our administrative boards and and all of the systems that we have, the environment that we teach in, our social environment, the physical environment, all of those things. If we externally do that, we may not change people's beliefs. We're not going to be able to change everybody's beliefs, because there will be people who not only have implicit bias, as we all do, but we will have people that are prejudiced. We will have people that are discriminate, and we will have people that are racist. It's hard to change those beliefs, but I truly believe that if we mandate changes in behavior, if we say this is acceptable, this is not, let's be aware of our implicit biases, let's look at our programs, let's look at our assessments, let's grow, that if we have that motivation to change all those kinds of behaviors, then I think the change in beliefs can follow. If we say, let's really look at this anew, let's be curious about this program and why we have so many students of color in this particular program. Let's look back at how we assess. That doesn't mean take them out. It doesn't mean put more of them in. It means let's look at it from a thoughtful, reflective way of, did any implicit bias impact what we did here? How can we change what we're doing to be more aware? And you have to commit. And what does that mean? As we wind up today, I want you to pick 3 specific strategies to help you become more bias aware at work. There's the transcript of this, there's PowerPoint of this. You can go back and look at all this and say, okay, I'm going to 1, 2, 3, write it down, write it down, 3 specific strategies you're going to do. Then I want you to discuss those strategies with someone else. This gives accountability. It also means that you learn about it more, because when you teach it to somebody else, when you share it with somebody else, then you are going to be remembering it better, learning it better. So you discuss it. You write it down, you discuss it. That builds accountability and follow through. Promise to continue to learn through books and articles and TVs and movies and friends and colleagues, etc. Don't stop learning. I have actually 2 pages of resources. These are more like research focused. That's the second page. But the first page, one is the implicit bias test that I recommended, and it's in all areas: race, age, gender, ableism. This is a really good one for people in the special education field. It has to do with how you see any implicit biases that you have over people that have special needs. This is a really good, it's a hard one. Take it. Learn about yourself. There is something called the 21-day racial equity habit building challenge. And this is where for 21 days, and the reason it's 21 days is that there's this theory that it takes 21 days to change a habit, and that if you do it for 21 days, you will continue to do it. These are articles, these are actions, these are movies, these are books. These are things for you to do every day that will build your understanding of bias, prejudice, racism, equity, equality issues, inclusion, all of that. 2 books. I always only recommend 2 at a time, because otherwise it's overwhelming. The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias, and Cast: The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. So lots of things to look forward to, I hope, from all of you. I'm going to stop share as I say goodbye to all of you for our time together. I really appreciate that you have been part of this hour with me. My hope is that it was a little uncomfortable, and that it made you think a little bit more and move away from status quo bias and be honest with yourself and be curious about your own biases. My hope is that as you go through the rest of the conference, that you will also pick up 3 strategies, 4 strategies, 5 strategies from every workshop, so that when you leave the days together that we have, that you will have a full plate of things to do to make your life as a teacher, administrator, parent, specialist even more enriching, more exciting, because what we do is great work. Thank you so much for your time.